Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lance Grande. He's a Distinguished Service Curator Emeritus at the Field Museum, and today we're talking about his book, The Evolution of Religions: A History of Related Traditions. So, Dr. Grande, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
Oh, thank you, Ricardo.
So we're going to talk about the evolution of religions and how they relate to one another. So before we get into religion itself, let me just ask you a little bit about some of the methodology that you apply in this kind of work and in your book specifically. So could you start by telling us about evolutionary systematics? What is that exactly?
Well, in its modern context, it's a classification of groups of things based on historical relationships and shared characteristics. We basically look at, characteristics that we think are uniquely derived for groups, and that's how we build these trees that tell us something about the history of things.
And what would you say that we gain from approaching religion or religions from an evolutionary perspective? What kinds of insights do we get from that?
Well, it gives us a broader understanding of diversity with this historical perspective of connections and shared foundations. And I think that's something that is useful in any deep studies of history.
Mhm. And in, again, understanding a little bit how you approach things in your book, at a certain point you say that you examine the evolutionary history of major groups of religions in an agnostic context. So what is that agnostic context? What does that mean in this case?
By agnostic, I simply mean as a historian, such an approach is necessary for an unbiased comparison among so many thousands of different things out there, religious ideologies in this case.
I mean, do you think that perhaps approaching it from either a religious or an atheist perspective would bias the approach here?
Yes, because then you're going into it thinking you already know the answer. And if you go into something already knowing the answer, it becomes less scientific in its core.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we're talking about religion. Most people perhaps think that they know more or less what religion is about, but what actually is religion? What is religion? What counts as a religion?
It's a tricky concept because it's defined so differently by so many different people. I mean, that's one way that social sciences differ from the biological sciences, and that in the biological sciences, there are rules for naming groups and understanding what a group means. Those things don't exist in the social sciences so much. So people use names and they mean all kinds of different things, especially with something like religion. So the most critical thing for me was to clearly define how I was using it, because that's the only way that then it can make any long-term sense to other people studying the same subject. So I usually I try to remain as unbiased as possible. So I define a religion in its most broad sense as a supernatural belief system. And then within that, I identify a subgroup called organized religion, which I identify as formally codified and institutionalized religions. I go from there and then start to look for the subgroups of these things.
But of course, I think we're going to get back into the topic of organized religion. But since you mentioned it now, and you say that it's basically about institutionalized religion, I mean, what does institutionalized religion mean? I mean, at what point do you say that a religion in a particular society is institutionalized?
Well, these are generally belief systems that have laws and traditions and specific organizational structures and revered figures and a number of other things that we can compare and look for similarities and differences in the way we classify the thousands of different belief systems out there.
Mhm. And is there any particular reason? I mean, was it just out of your own personal interest, or is there any other particular scientific reason, let's say, for you to have picked religion? Because I imagine you could have done the same with any other cultural phenomena or cultural phenomenon in human society. Do you think that religion plays a particularly important role in human societies or not?
I do, and I picked it also because there's kind of a revolution in the social sciences today. There's a long history of evolutionism and even broad comparativism in the social sciences. Shortly after Darwin published The Origin of Species, some social scientists were drawn to it to look at culture, but early on in the late 19th and early 20th century, many of these workers were looking at evolution as a ladder of progress or as some innate qualitative thing. And that led to all kinds of bad consequences, ranging from eugenics to worse. And as a result of that, social sciences largely rejected not only evolutionism eventually, but even broad comparativism. And but in the meantime, the biological sciences completely changed the way they looked at evolutionary studies. And rather than looking at evolution as some sort of ladder of progress, which they no longer do, they started looking at evolution as simply diversification over time in a non-qualitative way. So that way of looking at evolution has been slow to re-enter some of the social sciences. Linguists have embraced it, and so there are a lot of linguists who now use phylogenetic evolutionary techniques, but it's been very slow to penetrate other areas like history of religion studies. So, I mean, I've always liked a challenge, so I picked history of religion studies, and this is where I landed.
Mhm. But do you think that nowadays, particularly in the humanities, and when you try to approach religion through a perspective coming from the humanities, that there's more acceptance of using or applying evolutionary theory or not?
That remains to be seen. Again, in many aspects of the social sciences, like history of religion studies, there is still resistance not only to any kind of evolutionary approach, but even broad comparativism. I mean, there's a school of the social sciences, sometimes called particularism, which basically says stay in your own lane and don't go outside of that. But as somebody interested in the broadest and deepest history, I'm drawn to things that are much broader in their look at diversity, and that's part of what drew me in here, and it's been interesting to see the reaction to it, both positive and negative.
Mhm. And why do you think that religions are so common across human societies? And since we're also talking here from an evolutionary perspective, do you think that we have evolved to being predisposed to religiosity in any way, that it is something innate in human beings, or is it, for example, a byproduct of other psychological adaptations we might have evolved? I mean, do you have any particular position when it comes to that kind of question, if religion is something that we are predisposed to, innately predisposed to, and if it's the result of natural selection?
Well, there are many ideas about that, as you might guess.
Yeah.
They range from just say some sort of ambiguous noting of the broad diversity of religion to some scientists even claiming there's a genetic component to it, which of course is hotly debated. It does seem to be ingrained. I mean, according to a 2010 study by the Pew Research Center, only about 2% of people are strict atheists, and another 10% are agnostics. The rest appear to follow one particular branch of religion or another today. Although that's
those
constantly
two,
changing.
let me just ask you, those 2% that are strictly atheists, what does that 2% correspond to? Are we talking about the entire global population or everyone that ever existed? What are we referring to there exactly?
We're referring to a single study by the Pew Research Center in 2010 on the population of the early 21st century on the planet. So that it's a specific point in time. And of course, they weren't able to survey 7.5 billion people, but it's a representative sample that it was quite a large sample involving countries across the globe.
Yes, because I was wondering if today in the 2020s it would still be only 2% of people who identify as atheists in the world.
You know, nobody knows. I mean, the Pew survey was the last one of its size. So I'm sure they will try and repeat that at some point in time, but it was an enormous project. But you know, 2010 is fairly recent. So it's good to at least have something that you can look at.
Do we have any idea if there ever was any human society which lacked religion altogether, where no religion, which didn't have any sort of religion at all?
Well, again, that depends on how you define religion. And in the most general way that I define it, supernatural belief systems, although there's no way of proving it, I suspect that it went back close to the, it went back probably at least 100,000 years or more, because, I mean, the early forms of supernaturalism would have been more animistic, maybe in terms of being awed by the natural phenomena, you know, the wind, the storms, the sun and the moon, but also by, say, the value of maternal things that, you know, I mean, basically early clans, they were dependent on mothers producing children or they disappeared. And so there are probably some reverence attached to that. And that is sometimes thought to be demonstrated by the abundance of these Venus figurines that we find in the archaeological record going back 40,000 years or so. But, you know, like all things that go back so far in history, we can only speculate about the most distant reaches of human culture.
And since we're also going to talk here today about how some of at least the main or biggest religions relate to one another, do we have any idea at all, or is it possible for us to know how many religions would have existed in human history?
You know, I estimate there must be at least 10,000 branches of religion today, and many times that amount that have gone extinct over time. But this is a conservative generalization. Some people have proposed that every individual has its own particular religion because every individual has a slightly different way of looking at these things. Sometimes they combine the ideas of one religion with another religion or certain aspects of it, or sometimes they'll ignore one element of an organized religion. I mean, there are so many different ways that you could almost make the case that every individual has its own distinct religion. But again, that's not so different from the case in biology where you could say, well, every organism has its own genotype. That doesn't stop us from then identifying specific groups of comparison, like species, which can contain a lot of genotypic variants, but we form these specific groups based on all these specific shared characteristics, and that gives us a group that we can compare to another group. We do much the same with religions because we can identify these traditional groups that, at least the way they were founded, and recognize that, well, everything continues to diversify, and even those traditional groups go on to branch into many different subgroups.
Mm-hmm. And because there are these relationships between religions, as we're going to talk about in a second, the relationships between some of them, is it easy to strictly separate one religion from another? Like, I don't know, is it possible at all to say, okay, so here we have Judaism, and from this point onward, it's already Christianity or something like that? I mean, is it possible to make that separation precisely or not?
Well, every definition of groups and every pattern of relationship we find is only a hypothesis.
Okay.
I mean, that's how science works. We make hypotheses, and then these aren't meant to be final word. I mean, that's one of the things that separates science from fundamentalist religion. That is, every hypothesis we create is meant to be tested by future workers, and if the ideas there are superseded by greater evidence, they're meant to be modified and adjusted over time. And science is a continually refined process that continues to test itself and make changes and hopefully improvements to what it proposes.
And of course, we can represent the relationships between the different religions in the form of an evolutionary tree or a phylogenetic tree. But do those trees represent in any way ladders of progress or universal improvements? I mean, does it follow any sort of, let's say, teleology or something like that?
Well, as we talked about before, there was a time when early evolutionists thought that there was some sort of innate path of progress to evolution. But that has been abandoned by evolutionists since, and we no longer look at evolution as a ladder of innate progress. We simply look at it as diversification over time as groups respond to the particular environments that they're in. Sometimes an environment will select for specific groups, but the thing to remember is those environments are constantly changing too. So what may be a selective advantage for a group at one time and place may be a disadvantage in another. So there's no real innate qualitative control or ladder of progress here. It's simply trying to decipher what the diversification history of things has been over time.
So we can't say that, for example, one particular organized religion is an improvement over another different organized religion, or that organized religion even itself is better in some way, is better than supernaturalism, right?
Yeah, and scientifically we would never do that. Of course, that's when we're taking an unbiased look at things. And as we know, a lot of people who are vested in religion aren't there to take an unbiased approach. They're there to promote a particular branch or another, which then makes it something other than an unbiased scientific analysis of history.
And how do we decipher then the patterns of relationship between the different religions? How do we do that?
Well, we basically look for patterns of characters. Well, I should say, whether it's in biology or culture, that's one of the steps we do, is we look for these shared characteristics in particular groups that appear to be unique to these groups, and that we can theorize they're shared because they were all derived from a common ancestor. Now, with culture, we have an advantage over biology that biologists don't have, and that is so much of the diversification of culture occurred during literate time that we have written contemporaneous records of things like founders or ancestors and diversification patterns. That's something that biologists would only dream about because, again, most speciation events happened millions of years ago. So there's no way of having any kind of historical written records of it. All we have are these character patterns, which we use to hypothesize patterns of relationships that we then explain with our theories of evolution. But culture has this added piece of information that is very valuable and gives us sometimes a very solid pattern of relationship.
Mhm. And I would also imagine that it would be very complicated, or that it is in fact very complicated to disentangle the effects that natural and cultural selection might have had on religion, or separating what is biological from what is cultural, right?
Yeah, it's hard to. I think when we're dealing with cultural evolution, we're
Mhm.
pretty much confined to ideologies
Mhm.
and traditions and uh, the biological evolution is a completely different entity than the cultural evolution. It's possible that one may um, influence the other in some ways, but they're really separate elements in deep history.
Mhm. By the way, you use the word ideologies there. Does it have a specific meaning in this context?
Well, in other words, the ideologies, it's an understanding or something having to do with human thought rather
Mhm.
than you know, growing an extra arm or something that's physical. I mean, it's you're dealing with uh, uh, group thought patterns rather than physical phenomena.
Mhm. And so, evolutionarily speaking, first of all, what is what you call in the book supernaturalism? And then we'll compare it to organized religion. But what is supernaturalism?
Supernaturalism is just the belief in anything that is beyond the, the natural. That is, a belief in some sort of spiritual essence or something that is basically beyond the physical world.
Mhm.
Um, so it it eventually becomes more organized with organized religion once we start um, putting structure into that. Maybe revered figures and different organizational structures and laws, commandments. I mean, all of these things, they eventually came to more formalize different types of religious belief.
Mhm. And do we have a good understanding of how we move from supernaturalism or even anthropomorphic supernaturalism to organized religion? Are there any particular kinds of steps that societies usually follow to get there or not?
It's a real generalization.
Mhm.
Again, it's not a ladder. It's not a
Mhm.
linear path. Um, but it's a level of generality more than anything else. So, I mean, supernaturalism is just this belief in the supernatural, and it was thought to have been, the earliest form of any kind of religion, because it started with sort of a pure animistic belief, that all things have a spiritual essence, whether it's the wind, the sun, the moon, or motherhood. All of these things were revered, probably by the most some of the earliest human cultures. And again, of course, this is all largely speculative because we're dealing with things well before any kind of written records or even anthropological records. Anthropomorphic supernaturalism seems to be kind of a natural addition eventually, because I think eventually they have a record of attributing human characteristics to these supernatural elements. So, this reverence for the moon became a moon goddess, the reverence for the sun, a sun god, and so on and so forth. They became actual entities of some sorts. And eventually these beliefs became more and more formalized, as did other matters of social behavior among humans.
But then when we talk about organized religion, the first organized religions were polytheistic, right?
Yeah, they appeared to be animistic polytheism. That is, I mean,
Okay.
they were certainly polytheistic, but the gods still represented all these natural elements or phenomena of one sort or another. They became more social with time, and with time, the pantheons of gods even developed more hierarchical structures. You develop things like chief gods and god and various high goddesses, and this eventually evolved into more male-dominated pantheons, because it kind of followed the social structure of other parts of human society, where males came to dominate with armies and emperors and all kinds of other things. So there was this constant change, and we can look back historically on it, and we can see historically different chapters of it, even though it wasn't any kind of progressive thing. It was simply the change we observed over history.
And geographically, do we have any idea where the first organized religions developed?
That's a really tough question, because again, like all things in deep history, the further back in time you go, the more speculative our ideas become. Now, going back to the earliest organized religions, we know that both that there were two massive groups that developed before 11,000 years ago. One was the Indigenous Eastern organized religions, and the other was Indigenous Western organized religions, which also contained part of Northern Africa. Now, although that they go back at least 11,000 years, there were probably much older ones, particularly from other parts of the African continent where humans were first evolving. But unfortunately, most records of the earliest indigenous African religions, other than these Egyptian ones, were lost, partly because they developed so long before any kind of literacy, but also because Muslim conquests of the northern half of the continent and Christian conquests of the southern half. Part of the objectives of conquest was not only to convert, but also to subvert the histories of these other belief systems. And sometimes that even included destroying records wherever they did exist. So it's a tough question. And but like all things in evolutionary studies, we only have what we have to work with, and so we look at the evidence we have and try to do the best we can with that. The same is true in biology, of course. We the further back you go in the fossil record, the less information we have, and the less these things look like modern animals, and so the less we understand them.
I imagine that it's more or less the same that we find when studying languages, because, for example, we can go back up till Proto-Indo-European and establish the relationship between Proto-Indo-European and all the major European and Western Asian languages, but we don't exactly know what came before that. Right.
Exactly. And again, the linguists, they're the ones that are sort of leading the pack in social sciences and bringing phylogenetics back into the social sciences. Hopefully that'll spread to the other areas of the social sciences with time.
So you mentioned there Western indigenous organized religion and Eastern indigenous organized religion. Are those the two main original branches of organized religion?
It appears to be based on the information that we currently have, but again, that's based on an incomplete data set, and it'll probably always be changing as we find out more and more going on. Part of it is that this is kind of a different way of looking at these studies, and what I've done is simply set out some templates and ideas that I'm hoping will be then modified by specialists in all these areas and continued. And I mean, that's how it works in the biological sciences, that there are generalists that work with specialists, and it goes back and forth between specialists and generalists and specialists and generalists. But that's how we develop these finer and finer tuned patterns of evolutionary diversification in the biological world. I'm hoping that the same thing will happen now in these areas of the social sciences.
But as far as we know, at least for now, it is from these two main branches that all the other major organized religions branch.
Again, that is based on the groups that I looked at. Those are the patterns that I come up with.
Okay.
That's not to say that there aren't other say earlier groups that will be discovered on the African continent, for example. But yeah, when you look at these Western groups, I mean, the Western groups not only involved the Mediterranean region and the northern parts of Africa, but also spread to the Americas. I mean, that's all the New World, early New World religions came from the West. I mean, the English and the Spanish, they all colonized and basically sent conquests into the New World, and much of what eventually came there ultimately came from well, not only the West but the East. If we look at the way the continents were positioned, say going back 11,000 years, we can see there were land connections, for example, between Siberia and North America. Some people think that that's how humans first came into the Americas, it was by these sorts of connections, which means the earliest religions in the Americas were maybe offshoots of Eastern organized religions. But then, of course, later on, after we had for a while, we had the separation of North America from Asia when we lost the land connection across the Arctic region there. And these religions from the East Asian area developed independently in the Americas until many centuries later, when seafaring opened up again migration into the Americas from another part of the world, the West. And that's when these Western ideas and religions began to permeate the Americas. And that came in forms of conquest. Spain and England and all these powers, they brought powerful armies in, well, even small armies, but they came with weapons that the indigenous Americans didn't have: gunpowder, swords, horses, and they brought a lot of disease with them. And again, the result was most of the indigenous religions in the Americas at that point in time were either extinguished or highly modified. And I mean, the social evolution of the planet is very complex. And all these things had to be taken into consideration when we're trying to figure out the history of all of these different belief systems over time.
And when you try to study how particular religions or where they originated and how they evolved over time, do you look into specific factors that might have played a role there? Like, for example, ecological factors, economic factors, political, social, cultural factors, philosophical factors, even. Do you look at specific kinds of factors or not?
I consider all factors that might indicate some historical relationship between groups. I mean, most ideologies have elements that were present in earlier belief systems. The first step is to look at as many social characteristics as possible, and then just look for those similarities that appear to be unique to certain groups. And then we can hypothesize that these were due to some sort of common ancestry at some point in time. We don't have to, we can look at, for example, all Abrahamic religions and find some aspects that are unique to them, whether it's, certain prophets or certain rules or structures. And we can use that to make these groups that have some sort of historical connection. But when we're doing those sorts of studies, we need to consider as many types of things as possible.
And I mean, those different factors would manifest in terms of, or translate into how particular religions spread across time and geography, but also perhaps would translate into the particular kinds of beliefs that develop over time in a particular religion. Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, these ideas of how things are related are all retrospective, of course. I mean, we're looking at these things today and trying to piece it all together.
Going back then to the two main branches that you mentioned earlier, and starting with the Eastern branch, could you tell us a little? Of course, we won't have time to go through all the different branches and ramifications here, but could you tell us a little bit about Asian Cyclicism? What is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I look at as the main indigenous Eastern organized religion that had its early roots in India. And it can generally be characterized by, seeing time as cyclic, with samsara, reincarnation, transmigration, yin yang, or other, cycles of existence, depending on which sub-branch you're talking about. It also includes usually employing some sort of mind-body meditative practices, whether that's yoga or whatever. It's an important part of most of these branches. And basically, they all emphasize correct ethical conduct over dogmatic scripture, which differentiates it quite a bit from the Western organized religions. And the main branches basically of Asian cyclicism we have are Hinduism, Buddhism, and the Taoic religions. But of course, we have that branch that entered the Americas at some point in time, and that connection and that part of deep history is somewhat more clouded because of its early date, but also the way that so much of that history was lost with the conquest from the West later on.
Right. So, but sticking to the East for a little bit more, so Hinduism, is it among the major organized religions that are still alive today? Is it the oldest of them all or not?
It's certainly one of the oldest we know of. I mean, it's thought to go back, at least 11,000 years or more in India, and it's unusual in that it has no single prophet, founder, or core inspirational figure, and it follows five basic tenets, basically dharma, which is the duty of maintaining order in nature, karma, which are the consequences of one's actions in this life on their future lives, samsara, which is the Hindu concept of rebirth, or like reincarnation of sorts, yoga, which is sort of aids to meditation, and its sacred texts are called the Vedas. I mean, Hinduism had its greatest early expansion under the Gupta Empire between the 4th and 6th century in India.
And of course, another major Eastern organized religion is Buddhism. What could you tell us about perhaps its origins and its phylogenetic relationships?
Buddhism evolved from the Sramana movement in India in the 5th century BCE, along with Jainism. And the Sramana movement rejected the Vedas of Hinduism, and it followed the teaching, and at least Buddhism followed the teachings of this charismatic spiritual founder, Gautama Buddha, otherwise known as the Buddha. And the great expansion of Buddhism began with Ashoka the Great, ruler of the Maurya Empire in the 3rd century BCE. Like so many major religions, they were tied to emperors at some point in their history, which greatly expanded their influence around the globe.
And now the main places where we can find Buddhist people are in Asia, right? In Eastern Asia, particularly.
That's right. They kind of moved their core from India out eastward.
And what about Taoism? I mean, where does it come from, and how does it relate to the other Eastern religions?
Well, Taoism is part of a more general group I call Taoic religion. And it's a branch of Asian cyclicism that formed in China. And it formed two major groups, Taoism and Confucianism in China, and then also spread to Japan as Shintoism. I mean, most Taoic branches are polytheistic, and they emphasize a very strong reverence for ancestors.
And so you mentioned Confucianism there. I mean, when it comes to Confucianism and Buddhism, for example, many times people talk about them as philosophies or religions? I mean, does that debate matter here? Does it matter if they are philosophies or religions?
Well, for me, if they're philosophies that are tied to supernatural beliefs, then they constitute religions in the most basic sense.
Mhm,
But it's true, the um, Tao, Taoism was basically a philosophical type of what I call religion, partly because Taoism was founded by a philosopher named Laozi in the 6th century BCE and emphasized natural order, whereas Confucianism was also founded by a philosopher, Confucius, in the 6th century BCE. It differed from uh, Taoism in that Confucius emphasized social order rather than natural order. But basically, there was the same overriding philosophical base that guided it.
mhm. So we've gone through some of the major organized religions in the East. Now looking at the West, and you mentioned earlier North Africa, Europe. So let's talk a little bit about the Afro-Euro-Mediterranean organized religions. What are the main dominant religion, the most dominant religions that we have to consider here?
Well, today, the most dominant religions by far are Christianity and Islam,
Mhm.
which collectively make up more than 60% of all religious people, according to the 2010 study by Pew Research.
Mhm. But then, for example, within Christianism, we now have many different kinds of branches, right?
Oh, we do, for sure. Christianity and both Islam, again, as I say, they make up
Mhm.
60% of all religious people.
Yeah,
There are thousands of different branches.
yeah.
Even though both Christianity and Islam are forms of Abrahamic religion, who you could say the mother religion of Abrahamism was uh, uh, Judaism of sorts. And although even though today traditional Judaism makes up less than 8% of all religious people, according to the Pew study, you could say it is again the mother religion of the others, that it just diversified over time. I mean, that's a phylogenetic perspective.
Mhm. And could you tell us a little bit about Greco-Roman polytheism? Because, of course, when talking about particularly Western civilization, many times people refer to Greece and Rome as the cradle of Western civilization. So, how do those polytheistic religions connect to the rest in the West?
Well, the Greco-Roman civilization is called that because the Roman civilization adopted so much of Greek civilization
Mhm,
as it came into power. Even if you look at even the gods of the Greek pantheon, many of those same gods were simply given new names and transformed into the Roman pantheons over time. Um, the rise of Greco-Roman civilization was a key part of the rise of Western civilization, and it's the religion permeated that. I mean, the rulers of Greco-Roman civilization, they closely tied themselves to the pantheons of polytheistic gods they had. I mean, many emperors were even deified as part of the pantheon. It was only later in the 4th century CE that the Roman Empire eventually adopted monotheism as its state religion.
mhm. And earlier I asked you how we went or how we go from supernaturalism to organized religion, but now how do we go from polytheism to monotheism? Do we have a good understanding of that?
Well, at first there was a pantheon of many gods.
Mhm,
I mean, in fact, there were many different pantheons, different regions. Uh, Almost every different region of the area had its own specific pantheon. Sometimes they had different gods in charge. Eventually, these pantheons came to recognize a chief god. And so there would be a kind of a god in charge. And as gods adopted specific roles throughout these pantheons, and this organizational structure was built. And eventually this developed into a chief god becoming an only god. And of course, once that happened, that was the rise of monotheism. This fit well for empires, where there was always a ruler looking for divine support to enhance universal respect. Emperors were sometimes inducted in the pantheons of gods, as I said, but once monotheism developed, emperors began to also claim some sort of special relationship to the one and only God. So again, the empires and early forms of these polytheistic and early monotheistic religions, they kind of went hand in hand.
Yes, and it's very interesting because you mentioned there that in polytheistic religions we tend to have a hierarchy among the gods, and even in Christianity, for example, of course, there's just one single God, but we also have lots and lots of saints. So it's almost as if that sort of hierarchical organization also translated into some of the monotheistic religions, but instead of saying that the other divine entities are also gods or minor gods, we call them saints in Christianity, for example. Right.
Yeah, a large part of it is just a change in terminology, but you're right. The differences between the pantheons of say, sub-gods is not that different from the group of saints. I mean, I remember I went to a parochial school growing up, and I remember the nuns telling us, well, if you lose something, you pray to this saint, or if you want something else to happen, you pray to that saint. I mean, at some point, the similarities are extremely close there, and it's interesting. In fact, the early conquests of the Americas, often some of the strategies were when the Catholic Church would come into an area and try and convert the masses. They would go to a place of worship that had different statues of different gods, and sometimes simply rename or use those same statues to represent different saints. That had the advantage of making people more comfortable with this change that was being forced upon them. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of historical progression that we see. I don't mean progression in terms of progress. I mean, just it's the way that it happened.
Yeah, in terms of change, right?
It changed.
So, and what do we know about what might have been the earliest religious manifestations of monotheism?
Well, of course, we're dependent on archaeological information for that, so we can only speculate. But some of the information that we do have was, for example, in the 14th century BCE of Egypt, Pharaoh Akhenaten declared the chief god Aten in the pantheon there to be the only god at some point. And this was what's sometimes called Atenism. And so for a brief period, we had this monotheism there, which the pharaoh and his wife claimed a special relationship to, and being the intermediaries to, which gave them an added amount of power, of course. But this was very relatively short-lived, because once he died, the old priests of the older pantheon looked at him as sort of a heretic in a way, and brought things back to the older pantheon, and Atenism basically disappeared. It wasn't until about the 12th century BCE that we had another form of monotheism rise called Zoroastrianism. This was basically from the Persian prophet Zoroaster, who recognized the chief god Ahura Mazda. This became a monotheistic religion that actually still survives today, mainly by a group called the Parsis in India, even though it developed originally in Persia. And finally, the most successful of these, of course, was Abrahamic monotheism, which developed in the 6th century BCE. And again, it started not as monotheism, but as a polytheistic belief system. But at some point, one of the gods, Yahweh, was recognized as a chief god of the pantheon. And eventually there was a movement that developed called the Yahweh alone movement. And that eventually recognized Yahweh as the only God. And this is generally represented by a number of important patriarchs, such as Abraham, Noah, and Moses. And it took the form, it first took the form of what we think of as traditional Judaism, but then eventually diversified into all these other branches.
And when it comes to the three big Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianism, and Islamism, how do you look at the phylogenetic relationships between them?
Well, again, I see Judaism as a term is commonly understood as the sort of the mother Abrahamic root that eventually diversified into Orthodox Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and some of the lesser known extinct branches, such as the Essenes and the Ebionites. Again, diversification is a never-ending process.
And so let's focus perhaps a little bit here on Islam specifically. How did it rise and how does it relate to other religions?
Well, Islam arose in the 7th century CE in the Arabian Peninsula around a prophet named Muhammad. And although it arose as a branch of Abrahamism, it began as one that considered Christianity and Orthodox Judaism to have wandered off the correct path and distorted the original message of the prophets. Its early success was due to its symbiotic relationship, once again, with ruling powers, the medieval caliphates or the Muslim empires.
And what is, because you mentioned some of the doctrinal core of, for example, when we're talking about the Eastern religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, what is the doctrinal core of Islam?
Well, the doctrinal core of Islam is tied to its sacred book, the Quran, and its belief in the one God, Allah. Muhammad is considered the last of 25 prophets listed that begins with Adam and includes Noah, Abraham, Moses, and even Jesus, among others. But its last and ultimate prophet was Muhammad. It had an early history that involved a lot of conflict. Some historians have even called Islam a warrior religion, but this is generally a non-Islamic perspective because all major Abrahamic religions had these at times violent periods of expansion.
Yes, and sometimes, I mean, nowadays particularly, sometimes we hear people claiming that Islam particularly is very prone to having a very close relationship between the state and the church, but that also happened, at least historically, with the other major Abrahamic religions like Christianity and Judaism, right?
That's true.
And in Islam, we hear lots of times people talking about the Sunni and the Shia. What are these two different groups and what distinguishes them?
Well, the Shia believe that Islam's divine leader must be a blood descendant of Muhammad, and the Sunnis do not. This is this has led to a lot of serious clashes between the two groups over time. The Sunnis represent the majority of Muslims, and they include about 85% of all Muslims. It's it's an interesting dynamic that developed there, and it goes all the way back to shortly after Muhammad's death.
So let me then just ask you, before we go on to some more general questions to wrap up the interview, let me just ask you a little bit more about Christianity, because at a particular point there was a sort of a schism between the East and the West in Christianity. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, what was that schism about? How did it start? And so on.
Well, there have been a number of schisms within Christianity, of course, but there's also the a schism between what became known as the Roman Catholic Church and Protestantism. I mean, basically, part of it was fueled by, say, what are sometimes referred to as the bad popes, but basically there was a period in time when Catholicism in Rome was raising money by selling indulgences. That is, you could give a certain amount of money to the church, and that would get your soul out of purgatory all the more quickly. I mean, there were abuses like this that were happening at a larger and larger rate until finally there was this split between Protestantism and what again became known as Roman Catholicism. But that was only one major split of many that would occur over time within the major branches of Christianity. Again, Christianity was like all of the other religions in that there's no way to stop the diversification over time. And sometimes that's due to the springing up of just new beliefs. Sometimes it's due to people perceiving that the church is being poorly led by authoritative figures. There are all different kinds of reasons for it, but it just never stops.
Mm-hmm. And that also includes, for example, when Europeans went to the Americas and elsewhere, but particularly in the Americas, they exported different forms of Christianity, Catholicism, and Protestantism. And in the Americas, we nowadays can see very many different Christian denominations, right? That are
Yeah,
derived from that.
the Americas is a very complex situation because, again, the conquest was so overwhelming that so much of the actual indigenous belief systems were either wiped out or modified in such a way that they were no longer recognizable. There were many sort of hybrid belief systems in the Americas now that you can go to certain regions and see, say, forms of Christianity that were highly influenced by Mayan polytheism, or you can find these different combinations. These really aren't merges so much in a phylogeny as, say, you could look at it as certain Mayan branches that developed Christian characteristics and certain Christian branches that developed Mayan characteristics. I mean, ferreting the details of that out are are going to be very complicated jobs for specialists in those areas going forward.
Mhm. And also another thing that happened, particularly with us, the Portuguese, and also the English or the British, was that we took African slaves to the Americas. In our case, the Portuguese, it was to Brazil mainly, and then there's also a sort of hybrid religions that are a result of some elements of some of those, I mean, smaller African religions merged with elements of Christianity, and also sometimes merged also with elements of the tribes that lived in Brazil originally.
Yeah, I mean, but we can't underestimate the sheer power of those conquests. They just so overwhelmed things in the Americas that it is it's interesting to speculate what would happen if it was in fact the New World that invaded the Old World and had been successful in spreading their beliefs there. How different the world would be today.
Mhm. So toward the end of the book, and now I'm going to ask a few more general questions. Toward the end of the book, you talk about four historical trends in the evolution of religions, and I would like for you to explain each of them. So the first one is all major religions are historically interrelated at some level. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, I mean that's a lot of social sciences scientists in history of religion studies don't look at the broad comparison of things because again, it's this broad comparison is still slow to permeate into some of these studies. But one of the things that seemed apparent to me is that if we do look broadly, we can see that all these religions are historically interrelated, interconnected at some level. We just have to look at the historical records and the shared characteristics. If we go back far enough in time, all these ideologically connect at one level or another. I mean, you could look at, for example, the belief in the most general belief in a higher power or some spiritual essence. That's common to almost all organized religions.
Mhm.
And as religions diversified over time, these sub-branches developed unique characteristics of their own, such as, like we discussed, Hinduism, Taoism, hard polytheism, linear monotheism, and so many others. It's a diversification that if you look at it in reverse, it's a consolidation.
Mhm. And the second major historical trend that you refer to is the symbiotic development between religions and empires. Could you explain that?
Yeah, if we look back in history, we can see a correlation that the most successful religions today were the ones that align themselves early on with rulers of kingdoms, empires, or caliphates. I mean, this symbiotic relationship strengthened not only the political powers that were using the religion to justify themselves, but also the associated religions that were now strengthened by these political powers. And
Mhm.
you could see this with, say, for example, the traditional Christianity with the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE, or with Islam in the medieval caliphates between the 7th and 8th century CE. Hinduism paired up with the Gupta Empire between the 4th and 6th century CE and became more powerful. And Buddhism with the Mauryan Empire between the 4th and 2nd century BCE. I mean, these are the four major religions today in terms of size, and they all teamed up at one point in their history or another with major political powers.
Another interesting thing that you point to in the book is that the leadership role of women in religion has generally declined through history. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it seems intuitive because early in human history, it makes sense. The success of the clan or tribe was totally dependent on women to propagate the population of that group. And therefore, motherhood was understandably worshipped. And you can see signs of this going back at least 40,000 years with this abundance of carved um, maternal figures, as women are emphasizing the reproductive parts. And these are relatively widespread in the archaeological record. We basically eventually spread that out into pantheons, which were a combination of male gods, but also still included powerful mother goddesses and also priestesses that were active in organizing worship of these things. But as civilizations grew in size and society, males began to dominate as soldiers, hunters, and rulers. And this sort of change was also reflected in changing organized religions, where males came to dominate more and more. Women at first became no longer leading figures of the pantheons. They eventually, in terms of even occupying clerical organizations. So you can look today at, where women have been excluded from clerical positions of authority. We have no female popes or grand ayatollahs, for example. I mean, and female clerics are even rare in most religions today. It was sort of a trend over time, and that's where we are today. And you can look at the status of women also in other religions, like in Islamic society, for example, where they sometimes have to undergo some relatively harsh conditions. I mean, having to hide their faces in public and not being allowed to drive, various things that again, I don't think that in early Islam, women, I think, had a much higher status because Muhammad was dependent partly on his wife to actually help his position grow over time.
Right. And then the fourth and final historical trend you point to is the impact of religions on the evolutionary fitness of our species. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I think, a lot's happened in human society since humans first started to develop on this planet. I mean, early on in human history, when there were only a couple 100,000 humans on the planet, the tribalistic aspect of religion may have been a competitive advantage for our species. Communal societies that developed early armies and educational facilities, agriculture, and other things, they outcompeted non-communal populations. But things have changed quite a bit today now with over 8 billion people on the planet. And tribalism, ideological conquest, chauvinism, they all basically interfere with our ability to deal with many global challenges today.
And so let me ask you a little bit about the future then. What do we know about the future of religion? Are there any particular trends that we are noticing in terms of people, for example, becoming more or less religious?
This is one area where I'm reluctant to even guess because there's really no way to tell what the future of religion will be. I mean, considering recent trends, the one prediction I can make is that the diversification of ideologies will continue over time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and what does that mean? Oh, I think that means we need to become more pluralistic and less tribalistic in our thinking about this type of diversity, or we risk fueling our own eventual extinction as a species.
So do you think that, for example, people learning about things that you write about in your book would be important? I mean, having a better and broader historical understanding of religions would be important for the survival of our species.
I think so, because if nothing else, it would help us more collectively deal with the challenges that face us today on the planet. And it also may decrease the level of violence that seems to be growing today with or between different societies that are enhanced by these religious differences.
So let me ask you then just one last question. At the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the agnostic approach that you have in the book. Do you think that by explaining religion and religions in the plural and how they evolved over time and where they come from, their perhaps evolutionary and cognitive basis, that we are at the same time explaining religion away in the sense that it would sort of commit us to atheism or not?
No, I don't think that's true at all. Agnosticism, again, is not the same as atheism. I mean, agnosticism is simply an open, less biased perspective. I mean, it's the opposite of ideological chauvinism. I mean, and a move towards agnosticism and broader understanding is needed today, at least by historians, because if we're really trying to understand deep history, we can't take a biased approach. I mean, it's fine to be guided by positive elements of a particular faith, but there's no way of knowing which particular sub-branch is true or false. And using a particular faith to justify intolerance and bigotry is not only unethical, it's detrimental to our future.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, perhaps the question I was asking you was slightly different. But what I was trying to understand here is there are some atheists that make the claim that if through science we can explain religion, where it comes from, how it evolves, then that would necessarily commit us to atheism because we are basically explaining the religious beliefs away, in a sense. Do you agree with that?
I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, I think a pluralistic attitude is not the same as an agnostic one, because even forced or mandatory atheism would be not unlike a fundamentalist religious belief that was forced. Again, we are humans that are always going to have a diverse set of ideologies about such basic things. And I think we have to come to grips with that and figure out how we're going to deal with that going forward.
Great. So the book is again The Evolution of Religions, a history of related traditions. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Grande, apart from the book, would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Well, I mean, I suppose you could always go to Wikipedia. You could find me, but I mean, basically, you can find books I've done on University of Chicago press site and the Columbia press site. Basically, I would just welcome anybody to come in and check out the Evolution of Religion book because, again, I'm hoping that it'll give people a much broader perspective on something that does seem to be such an ingrained part of human culture.
Yeah, and I recommend the book because there you also go into much more detail when it comes to each specific religion and their phylogenetic relationships. So I definitely recommend the book as well. And Dr. Grande, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a very informative conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ricardo. It's been fun.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sundo, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fort, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.